afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to spend an hour with you. I appreciate the opportunity. It's definitely one of my passions to educate people on transgenderism so that you can reduce your prejudice and improve your skills as a clinician and helping them feel more comfortable. I began working in the trans community in 1984, and I received most of my education from my clients at the time, because at that time in human sexuality classes of the graduate programs, all it had was one paragraph on transvestism and one paragraph on transsexuality, and the term transgenderism hadn't been coined yet. So the community was small and underground, and they really appreciated to have somebody on the side that wasn't judgmental. Let's begin with the context of being professional counselors. How many of you are counselors? Okay, most of you, okay. Because we have a responsibility to be aware of our countertransference when we're working with gender creative clients and their families. It's going to come up, it'll definitely be revealed if you're uncomfortable with the issue or you don't know too much about it, and that will make the client feel uncomfortable. So it's great that you're here and you're willing to spend a little bit of time learning about it. Sometimes it requires an extra lot of patience working with gender creativity, because what we might think is very easy, why don't you just jump through this hoop, might take them a year or 2 or 10, and we have to have patience with that. So please, by a show of hands, who's been exposed to trans or transgenderism in some way, even in the media? Looks like everybody. Okay, it's more than I thought. It's great. Who has a friend or family member who's trans? So now we're getting closer to home. And who's worked with a gender variant or a transgender client? Wow. Okay. So we have a lot to learn about today, and have an hour to do it. So let's get going. Okay. So there's 9 topics that we're gonna check out today. Have a look. This is an interactive session, so I hope you'll ask questions along the way. And before we begin our discussion, we need to know something about the terminology we'll be using. So who knows what the word cisgender means? Okay, going to find it for us.
Cisgender is the gender that you were assigned at birth that you identify with.
Yeah. So how many people in here identify as cisgender? Yeah, most of you. Most of you are probably cisgender. That's what kind of the ordinary way of going is that you're born either male or female, you're raised as a girl or a boy, you're attracted to the other sex. Most people, it's a different issue, sexual orientation and gender, so most people are cisgender. We're going to look at this genderbread person. This is a really great slide to clarify the different continuums that we have. Most people are really familiar with sexual orientation, and that's who you feel attracted to, who you want as your intimate partner, and who you're spiritually connected with. So sexual orientation's a pretty easy one to go with. It's pretty clear. The third one is gender expression. It's either feminine or masculine at the other end, or neither feminine or masculine, or both. And it's a way of expressing yourself in how you talk and how you dress, in your mannerisms. The next one up is the anatomical or the biological gender, which is your chromosomal gender, like XX or XY, your secondary sex characteristics, whether you have a penis, testes, vagina, breasts, and all the physiological influences that go into making that biological gender. And then on the top one, we have gender identity, which is what I think, it's what's between your ears. We say it's what you think of yourself as. So regardless of how you express yourself or the anatomy that you have, you can still think that you're a little bit different. And that thinking that you're a little bit different than how you express yourself or your anatomy is what gender dysphoria is for transgenderism. So the binary models of identity, orientation, and gender, they don't reflect the complexity. As you can see here, there's so much more that goes into making a person male or female, gay or straight, or how they would want to express themselves. You might be wondering what causes gender dysphoria. There's no evidence that the social environment plays any role. And I mention this because I'm often asked by people questions like, is it because he was raised with 5 sisters, or is it because he was dressed as a girl as an infant? The etiology of transgender identity is unknown and heavily debated. However, there's been research which shows that the transgender brain is wired differently from the cisgender brain. Specifically, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland have been linked by a study in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism in 2000. There is some evidence that these brain differences may have their origins in utero. The genital development happens about the 8th week of gestation, and the gender differentiation in the brain happens in the second half of pregnancy. So the degree of masculinization on the genitals may not reflect the same degree of masculinization on the brain. For example, a male fetus that does not get the customary flush of testosterone during the 2 critical periods will not develop testes and a penis. Or the genitals may develop typically, but when it comes time for the brain to be masculinized in the second half of pregnancy, something goes awry. We would then have an anatomical male with a female brain. Another possibility could be that the fetus has an insensitivity to the hormonal influences that determine the gender of the brain. These theories are supported by the experience of trans individuals because they identify as trans in early childhood, usually before the age of 7. Does this help make sense to you? Do you understand how this condition can come about now? Okay, good. I'm glad that's clear. Achieve that goal. Now we're going to look at some terms. This is a minimal list of terms. I'm sure if I asked you, you could throw out another 100 terms that are currently used, and some, the ones here are politically correct and safe to use, but a lot of the other ones that I might ask you to throw out wouldn't really be appreciated or terms of respect for the community. So some of these terms on the slide refer to external anatomy, while others refer to internal identity or expression. So does anybody know what some of the acronym LGBTQIA, any of those letters?
Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, but I'm kind of lost there.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for that. Do you want to continue?
Queer, questioning, intersex, and asexual?
Yeah, good job. Okay, so that's a mouthful, and that kind of covers it all. So, like the term transgenderism. Transgenderism is an umbrella term, and all these terms can fall under the term of transgenderism. We'll go through a couple of these to define them. We don't use the word transgendered, they just don't prefer to be called transgendered people or individuals, so we call them transgender. Transsexual, F to M is female to male, or M to F is male to female. Transsexuals are usually people that want to blend into the other sex. They're not interested in gender bending or being creative or being cutting edge or culty or unique. They're people that want to pass, and they may or may not have sex reassignment surgery or go through hormone therapy, but they're people that want to blend into the binary model. Z and Zer are kind of newer terms for people that don't want to be called he and she. Gender identity is what a person thinks they are. Gender expression, how they express themselves. Gender queers, people that might go back and forth between male, female, and a third gender. Intersexed is a biological condition. Maybe XX chromosomes, and then they develop with a penis or testes. Androgyny, so people that don't really want to dress or express themselves as male or female. They want to be like neutral, just a person. They don't want to be identified in any kind of sexual or role-oriented way. Same with gender fluid. Cross-dress, we used to call cross-dressers transvestites. We don't anymore. There's kind of that's a diagnostic term, and there's a fetish attached to that, like there's a sexual component to it. So now we've kind of taken that out and just called them cross-dressers. And third gender, like on those boxes on forms where you write male, female, or third gender, so that's a very respectful and open and encouraging way for people to express who they are and not have to put themselves into a traditional box.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
So when you're using Z or Zer, Z would be female, Z is a happy person, and that's how you refer to that person? Or am I misunderstanding that?
When you, thank you for your question. So when you say Z or Zer, did you say are they a happy person?
No, like Z would be a female, instead of saying she is happy, you would say Z is happy?
Yes.
Okay.
And,
Interesting.
you know, personally, I find it kind of cumbersome and difficult, but I have had clients who want to be referred to like that, and I do my best. It's like anything else with practice, you get used to it. At first, it's a little bit of a tongue twister, but thanks for your question. Can somebody tell me the difference between gender identity and gender expression?
I actually had a question. That's the rate of sounding totally ignorant. Is intersexed then the new term for a hermaphrodite?
I don't know that it's a new term for it, but it is another term for it.
Another term, okay.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
Good question.
It's a good question. There's no bad questions, please, you know, if you have it, somebody else has the question too. Okay, so if you want to know more about these terms, I did make a trans glossary for you, if you can get it. And it also has a DSM-5, which we'll go over in a little bit, what the criteria is for it. So language is evolving, and I hope that soon we'll have even better terms to talk about the trans experience. When people have language that helps them understand that not everybody fits into the binary model, it helps them to be more accepting. So we're uncomfortable with things that don't make sense to us. And it doesn't make sense to some people to refer to Caitlyn Jenner as a woman, because we use the same word woman to describe cisgender female person. However, it might be easier to conceptualize if we use another term such as new woman or third gender woman. So you've been exposed to transgender characters in media. Who are they, and what shows are they in? Yeah.
A long time ago, before Caitlyn Jenner was even a thing, there was a comedian named Eddie Izzard he referred to himself as a transvestite, but he actually explains to the audience he's not gay, he's a crossdresser. And it actually becomes part of his thing, and then he went on to be in a show called The Riches. I don't know if anybody ever watched that show, but he's hilarious, and you wouldn't ever know just by seeing that he's a transgender cross-dresser or anything, you know.
Yeah, it was pretty brave to come out at that time. Yeah, thanks for your comment. I see some smiles and head shakes to your comment. Yeah.
Would Grace Jones qualify? Or was she just a female performer that dressed as a man?
Well, for sure that person would be a cross-dresser.
Okay.
Now, I don't know whether it was just because they're a celebrity and that's their costume they want to attract attention with, or that's actually something that's going on in their psyche, and because I don't know that person, but
Can I ask you a question before you go on?
sure.
Can you define the asexual? How do you look at that?
Somebody want to?
So someone who's not interested in having sex?
And not only not interested in having sex, but doesn't even identify sexually. You know, like what we would consider sexual body parts or erotic body parts are to them just like neutral flat parts, like a hand. You know, it's just like there's no energy there, there's no feeling. They don't want to use it in a sexual way, and they just want to be a person, not a sexual being.
It's interesting because there's some real bias with disability, bias belief that disabled people, especially the more severe they are disabled, they're asexual. You know, so if you're missing 3 limbs, people think you automatically become asexual. I mean, there's a bias that's, you know, misconception.
I saw a movie last year where they had somebody that was a paraplegic and they put him with, they hired a sex surrogate. And it really, I can't remember the name of the movie, you call it. They did a very good job of showing that just because the person is disabled doesn't mean that they're numb, and that, you know, he was able to enjoy himself sexually in all these different creative ways. Yes. Yeah. Okay, so these are some of the stereotypic transgender roles that we see in popular media, and we all know. Yeah. Yes, the new black. So you might have seen drag queens like RuPaul, Drag Race, or the Rocky Horror Show, or the criminals in Orange is the New Black, I heard someone say that. Or the victims, the TV crime shows like Boys Don't Cry, parent shows, the TV shows Transparent, and the reality shows, or Becoming Us, and I Am Kate, about fathers who come out as trans and begin transition. Has anybody seen any of those?
One just started.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's also a show called I Am Jazz.
Yeah.
That portrays a 13-year-old child.
Yeah, she has a book out now too. Yeah, and it's great. I'm not really focused on parenting or children in here because of the population, but she's helped so many children. Okay, let's take a look at the diversity of gender nonconformity. music got a little loud. So, from looking at you, I saw sometimes lots of smiles, sometimes I saw some grimaces. How was that for you watching that? Anything that you liked or surprised you, or anything that you have like an aversion to?
I just always had a quandary about the difference between a cross-dresser who identifies as a male but likes to dress in women's clothing, and they don't have, whenever I've worked with or come across with someone like that, they don't identify as a transgender because they don't want to be a female. They just want to dress like one and act like one. And then you have the middle of the road that started a cross-dresser, maybe wants to be a female, now she goes through the process of the sexual procedure to reassign. And then you have the other end that absolutely identifies as the female brain and is doing that cross as well. And it's such a myriad that I see, that I get confused as to where on that spectrum. And I noticed in looking at that, I can pick up the cross-dresser who is probably in the public eye as one and just uses it as their career, and then one who really identifies as the opposite sex, and then some that are in the middle. And I've always had a difficult time speaking to that spectrum because it's so vast.
Well, thank you for your comment. It is very confusing, and even they are confused. They don't always know from age 5 that they want to be a transsexual. They might not think about sexuality yet, and they might just think that they like dressing, a little boy likes dressing up in girls' clothes. But then when he's 15, it's a whole different thing when sexuality emerges. So I think you speak to a very important and continuous issue in therapy, which is that they might also be changing and growing around how they're identifying, and their family is also trying to adapt to how they're changing and growing. And they might not like it. You know, like it's one thing when people say, oh, you know, I'm identified as a cross-dresser, that works. But when they start having thoughts and feelings and figuring out that maybe they're more than a cross-dresser, maybe they're really transsexual, or maybe they really want to live their life full-time as a cross-dresser, then that becomes more complicated. Thank you.
I have an interesting question. If we have a form that we're filling out, it's easy, the words are there for us. But what if we would happen to meet somebody and we just really can't tell? What is the proper way to ask?
So that's a great question, thank you. So what would you like to be called? How would you like me to refer to you? So as clinicians, we do have to get the legal information to fill out, usually for insurance companies or whatever. So on our forms, we can say, what is your legal name? What's the name that, like your nickname? What's the name that you would like to be addressed by? Yeah, that goes a long way to helping them feel respected. Instead of saying, what's your real name? That's kind of a big.
We've had an issue along those lines where we have to transfer a patient out to another facility, but we don't know whether if it's a gender-specific facility, if they identify as female, and yet they have not undergone the gender reassignment surgery, but they identify as female. Do they go to a female center? Do they go to a male center? What is the doctor willing to say? What is the center willing to say? What do we say?
So that's a really good question. A couple of minutes of good patience with me. We're going to go over California law about, you know, what legally people can do and are allowed to do, whether they're minors or whether they're of age. And for most places, probably what's legal is probably what's going to dictate where you would send them. But yeah, we'll go over that question. Thank you.
You know, I know by virtue of being in the video, there was some kind of concern with gender or whatever, but I found that when the pictures of the younger folks came up, that was a little bit easier to look at, and as they became mature, I think it got really complicated, and it's just less clear. That's just my bias. It was less clear as to what was going on, and apparently later on, to me, it would be more of a struggle. Maybe not, but you know, as opposed to being younger and you're just sort of formulating things. Whatever.
I mean, how many people in here, by a show of hands, feel like when you see trans children that you have a little more openness, it's a little easier to relate to it, buy into it, and be kind of normal with it than somebody who's 60 and starting to transition and doesn't have that innocence of a pretty little face, and they've already been exposed to the other hormones for 50 years. And so how many of you would think it's easier to relate to the younger people? Yeah, I think many of us, you know, it's just, it's easier. It's, you know, it's not as awkward. It's, we don't have to get used to so many things. We don't have to go through a brain strain. And I think that's a really honest comment. So did you notice any particular pictures in there that stood out to you?
Yeah, I was not aware that that person, I had read about the person having a penis implanted into their stomach.
What was going on? There was a couple, yeah,
Yeah,
I just couldn't figure out what was
that
happening
one,
with
that
breastfeeding. Those were just, I couldn't even like figure out what I was seeing.
Okay, so I think that particular picture was a woman that became male for a while and then decided that he wanted to have a baby.
Okay.
And he wasn't too far along in his transition, so he could go back to being female and carry a pregnancy and do that. But that's not always a sure bet, because once they start taking hormone replacement therapy and changing their body, usually what the doctors say is, like, for women that they should donate eggs and freeze them in a sperm bank, or for men that they should freeze their sperm, because it does it become altered from being going through this process.
Well, thank you for the explanation.
Pardon?
Thank you for the explanation.
Oh, thank you for your question.
How much is the environment attributed to these feelings and or influences? Because I know it plays a part. That's what I've always traditionally heard, versus being solely genetic and solely hereditary. I mean, the environment does play a part, does it not, in the upbringing of a child and the influences and what they're exposed to?
Well, we haven't seen studies of where that's really proving anything. So it's still really debated. What we're seeing is that it's more coming out of physiology and genetics, and it's got a biological root. And hopefully in 10 or 20 years there'll be more research done on it, so we can actually like say, okay, it's right here on this gene. This is going to predict the anatomy or the identity or the expression of this particular child. Yes.
I noticed for myself, Robin Williams and John Travolta dressed up like women. I giggled because I think that there's less of a stigma now when we see men dressing up as women. It's something that, since Shakespearean times, men have done that. And so I think it's something that might shock us more because it's more evident that that's a man dressed as a woman. But I actually found, just for myself, a bias, and this might be terrible, but for the women that were presented on the screen that were obviously women, but that weren't carrying feminine traits. So say their hair wasn't done, or their makeup wasn't done, or they weren't, not necessarily their fashion, because I think fashion throughout time kind of is asexual in itself, but I was more responsive to women not being overtly feminine, as opposed to a man being more feminine. I don't know if that's that way.
Thank you.
This is a hard question, maybe, or maybe you'll get to it when you get to the legal part. But I worked in a program that had a court component and probation officers and people, whatever they were, it seemed to be decided by the probation office, and they didn't have any rights. Like one person had legally changed their name, and it was now a female name, and they said no, even though it was legal, they said that person could not go by that name. And then they also made the decision which restroom would be used by which person. Do they not have legal protection to use whatever restroom were to be called if they changed their legal name? Do we not have that right?
You're right behind me on my notes. We're gonna get to this, we're gonna get to this pretty short about the legalities. Do we have any other comments on the pictures that came up? Okay. Things have really progressed because as recently as 15 or 20 years ago, there were very few media portrayals of ethnic minorities or gay or lesbians, and now it's even become a daily occurrence on primetime TV shows. Now I'm going to give you some background information on the social, political, and legal status of transgender people. So worldwide, approximately 0.3% of people self-identify as part of the trans community. So what does that really mean? It means like 1 out of 1,000 people, which means that there's probably 3 trans people in every high school, and 1 trans child in every grammar school, and a child in every other junior high school that's gender dysphoric. In a large college, say of 60,000 students, there'd be 60 trans students. So even though it seems like a minuscule statistic, 0.3, it's more than 700,000 individuals in America. So we have some interesting statistics about the United States Department of Veterans Affairs. They treated 2,567 veterans with trans-specific care. So I think that's pretty surprising and very telling of that we are progressing to be able to deal with that there. According to the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, or GLAAD, in 2008, 8% of Americans personally knew someone in the trans community. Not too many. Look how far we've come, because most of you here, if not all of you, raised your hand saying that you did know someone trans or you were familiar with it. So we went from 8% to 100% just in the last 7 years. Does this mean that transgender people are accepted? We'll elaborate on these statistics as determined by the National Center for Transgender Equality. In 2011, NCTE conducted in-depth interviews with 6,450 trans individuals regarding their experiences with harassment, discrimination, and violence. And the majority of them, 63%, had experienced significant discrimination in schools, homes, workplaces, doctors' offices, stores, landlords, and the criminal justice system. So in effect, this is saying that trans people feel discriminated against almost everywhere they go. So there's no safe place for them. 15% of them were harassed badly enough that they were forced to leave school. And they experienced twice the level of unemployment than the general population. So in part, it's these types of early and continuous experiences of discrimination that sets them up for future problems. Here are a few more sobering statistics. The most sobering is that almost half had attempted suicide. That's pretty shocking, pretty sad. And speaks to how much we need you to help this population when they come into your office. And that you could probably expect if they're in your office, they probably fall into these statistics. Another way discrimination manifests is with the violence. It's not easy to be trans, but as therapists, we're one of the few individuals where they can feel safe and be accepted. However, it's not all bad news. There are some places where trans people have legal protection against discrimination. currently, there's 16 states plus Washington DC in blue on the map that have protection for trans people. However, there's no federal laws or military codes offering protection, but that may be changing soon. Which states offer employment protection for trans people? Yay. This means all Americans are protected. In 2012, the Supreme Court ruled that all employees are protected against discrimination based on gender, including trans employees. Additionally, when the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage, it made it easier for married trans individuals to legally change their gender without putting their marriage in jeopardy. However, the progress made in the past few years has predictably triggered a backlash. For example, in 2014 and 2015, 4 state legislatures introduced bathroom laws requiring people to use the bathroom corresponding to their biological gender. That's Texas, Nevada, Florida, and Kentucky. Unfortunately, even here in California, the Pacific Justice Institute is putting together an initiative for our 2016 ballots, which would require citizens to prove their gender before entering a public bathroom. And fine anyone $4,000 for refusing to comply. So be prepared. So be prepared, you may have to flash before entering the restroom. What else is happening with California law? California added transgender people to the list of protected groups, such as racial minorities. Because of this law, it's illegal in California to discriminate against trans individuals in work, education, or housing. The School Success and Opportunity Act, which allows underage trans students to use facilities, bathrooms, and participate in sports according to their gender identity. This is really important because kids who pass and are living stealth won't be forced to come out at school, which usually leads to being teased or bullied. For example, I had a 4-year-old male to female trans child last year who was in preschool. He had an anxiety disorder and he was stuttering. So he went to school dressed as a girl, and the children all knew that he was trans. And he got teased and bullied a lot. This year, he went into kindergarten as a girl. Because of this law, he was able to use the girls' restroom. So none of the kids know that he's anatomically male. He passes as a girl. He doesn't stutter anymore, and he doesn't have an anxiety disorder anymore. He's like she's a happy, well-adjusted girl, like getting ready to have her slumber party. So what about birth certificates? AB 1121 allows trans people to have their name and gender changed on their birth certificate simply by providing a note from their doctor instead of a court order. Once a birth certificate is changed, it's much easier to get a driver's license and other legal documents. This is important because identification is required for all sorts of transactions, including when you may be stopped by the police if your identification does not match the way you're presenting. It looks fishy. So one of the things that we can do as therapists is offer a letter explaining that this client is transgender. So it lends credence to it. But the other thing that they can do is they can have 2 identification cards. One's a driver's license that presents them as male, and a California identification card that presents them as female. Not everybody has a driver's license, so they can just get a California identification card. Also, beginning July 1st, 2014, the legal process for changing names was streamlined. All these hoops that they have to jump through in transitioning, nothing is like major hard, but there's about 100 of them, And it's very frustrating and tiring and exhausting that they actually have to go through so many things to just be who they are. Now we're going to peek into the mental health arena. Although from our perspective this can seem like a new phenomenon, in actuality there have been trans people across times and cultures. We know this because there's literary references from 2,000 years ago, like in the Bible, Deuteronomy 22:5. Let's pay homage to our founding forefathers. In the late 19th century, during the early years of the discipline of psychology, research regarding gender nonconformity was scarce. So if you think trans people are discriminated against now, in the past they were completely invisible. The earliest literature in the 1950s was based on institutionalized patients. Higher functioning gender nonconforming people were not represented or identified in literature because it wasn't safe for them to come out in society or even to the therapist. If someone exhibited gender non-conforming behavior, they would have been locked up in a sanitarium without much concern for a specific diagnosis. Or they would have been diagnosed as psychotic because they were denying what other people could obviously see. In the 1960s, our hero, Dr. Harry Benjamin, began working with the trans patients in his medical practice in New York. In 1966, he wrote a book called The Transgender Phenomenon, and in '79 he published the Standards of Transgender Health. These standards have been updated and developed over time and have morphed into what's now known as WPATH, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. How did the infrastructure grow in the trans community? In the early 80s, with the rise of talk shows like Phil Donahue and Jesse Raphael, our culture shifted when trans people became more visible and part of a larger conversation. This is demonstrated in the spike of gender nonconforming characters appearing in mainstream movies in the early 80s, such as Victor Victoria, Tootsie, and Yentl. As the movement gained momentum, conferences began to spring up, and later became inclusive of professionals, therapists, doctors, even families, and now in San Bernardino since 2007, there has been a camp for children. With the rise of the internet, trans people were able to find education and support using online forums. However, while the internet has greatly reduced social isolation, it has not assisted trans individuals in dealing with their social anxiety, and it's our responsibility to help them with that. In '98, PFLAG expanded their mission statement to include trans people. As the infrastructure developed, a larger, visible community with more members, more allies, and more advocacy. Let's look at the evolution of our familiar friend, the DSM. This is a bit dense. The DSM is a mirror of our forward progress in terms of cultural and intellectual understanding of complex ideas. Between 52 and 79, persons exhibiting gender non-conforming behaviors were diagnosed by the DSM as sexual deviants. Beginning with the DSM-3 in 1980, being trans was pathologized as a gender identity disorder. A heterosexual orientation was a key part of the diagnosis, and preferential treatment was given to heterosexuality by the medical community. For instance, a patient requesting hormone replacement therapy would be more likely to be accepted as a fitting candidate if they were going to transition into a heterosexual role, thereby making the patient more normal, fitting into the binary model. The DSM-5 has changes in the labeling and diagnostic criteria for trans clients that are a testament to our evolving understanding of the trans experience. For example, prior to 1973, homosexuality was deemed a mental illness in the DSM. Prior to the DSM-5, which was published in 2014, the condition was labeled as a disorder, which implies mental illness. The DSM-5 eliminates the stigma by changing the label from disorder to dysphoria. which is a descriptive term rather than a diagnostic term. So take a minute and please read the criteria from DSM-5. Lest you believe that everyone is on the same page, it would be inaccurate to portray the entire mental health community as being in agreement on these recent developments. For example, Paul McHugh, the former psychiatrist-in-chief at Johns Hopkins Hospital, wrote an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal reaffirming that trans individuals are suffering from a mental disorder that needs to be treated and that surgeries are not helpful to them. That was in 2014. This is an ongoing process and no one really knows what the future will bring in terms of our understanding of the trans phenomena. A new treatment model arose. What is this new treatment model? There has come to be two treatment models in working with transgender client, the traditional medical model versus the client empowerment model. Over the past few years in the field of psychology, positive psychology models are emerging as opposed to the former ones which pathologize thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And out of this emerged a new treatment model for gender non-conforming clients. The new treatment model is actually called the informed consent model, but it's easier to think of it as the client empowerment model. This model gives the decision-making authority to the client, and the role of the therapist has been redefined and limited to education and consultation. In the traditional medical model, the therapist and physician played the role of gatekeeper, having the authority and responsibility to assess if the patient was a fitting candidate for hormone replacement therapy and surgery. Under the informed consent model, the client no longer needs permission or approval and is able to assess for him or herself the timing of hormone replacement therapy and surgery. Of course, gender dysphoria doesn't occur in isolation. As clinicians, we need to look at the intersection between the gender dysphoric condition and the client's other issues. How can we help clients to have good mental and physical health when many are being treated like social pariahs? Being gender dysphoric often includes symptoms of depression, anxiety, antisocial behavior, and the general health problems. A secondary diagnosis is cultivated by internalized transphobia, secrecy, shame, guilt, being the object of discrimination, judgment, harassment, disrespect, and bullying from friends, coworkers, and family. Of course, almost everyone has these types of experience, but the frequency and intensity for trans people is continuous and often results in PTSD. Social anxiety is very common because they're not comfortable with themselves, and every public interaction brings the risk of confrontation, especially to those who do not pass very well. This can be even more pronounced in day-to-day situations like work, school, and housing. Growing up in fear, pretending to be someone you're not, or just being confused about who you are can cause a host of physical symptoms such as migraines and digestive problems. Some clients are reticent to see a medical doctor or even a psychiatrist because they're too embarrassed to reveal their bodies, or they've engaged in petting or self-harming behaviors. In addition to individual issues, there's the impact of living in a community where ideas of killing oneself are almost normalized in the immediate circle of friends. Remember the study I mentioned earlier about the 41% of trans people who attempted suicide. All these different issues, it's best practice when working with trans clients to consult with a colleague. As I'm sure you know, if medication is indicated, refer for an evaluation to a psychiatrist. How do we create a therapeutic alliance? This is what we're all good at, connecting with people, making them feel supported. Some of what we're going to review is best practices, but they're also just good reminders when working with gender non-conforming people. We want to create a safe and welcoming environment. For instance, I have an equality sign on the outside of my window, and I have pamphlets in my waiting room for trans clients. These are symbols of acceptance that can be displayed in the office, like a rainbow flag or a sticker. Your intake forms have different markers on them for gender. You can have an extra line for AKA or nickname. For the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to suggest some do's and don'ts. You already know many of them, but I just want to go over them to be thorough. Don't use transphobic words like training, she-male, he, she, or it. Even though some people in the community might use those words sarcastically, as humorous, it's perceived differently when you're outside of the community and you use those words. Use preferred pronoun regardless of their presentation. Do validate a person's gender identity and expression, even though it might be confusing if their name doesn't match their presentation. Do follow the client's terminology, such as how they refer to their body or the language they use. Be a role model of acceptance. Do appreciate the client's courage and thank them for trusting you and participating in therapy. Ask questions that demonstrate your understanding and compassion. Challenge traditional norms. Don't use judgmental language. Respect where your client's at in the coming out process. Be conscious of the impact of oppression and discrimination. Be cognizant of generational differences. Continue to learn about the GLBT culture, like you're doing today, and acknowledge their chosen family may not be their biological family. Respect that everyone's unique. Do not minimize your client's fear and anxiety. It might be rational. Do not assume that other mental health care providers are as forward-thinking as you. Clients may have been in therapy before, but not felt safe to come out. Seek consultation when needed, and do not rely on the client to educate the therapist. But of course, if you don't know, ask. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, so we have a couple of minutes, and we have like this little quiz that you were handed out. And an evaluation. So we really appreciate it to complete those. And let's go over the quiz just to make sure that you're clear about it. True or false? Transgenderism refers to both one's sexual orientation as well as their gender identity. Just call it out.
True.
False. False. Transgenderism does not refer to sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is a whole other category. That's who you're attracted to. Okay, true or false? Not all states have legal protections for trans employees in the workplace.
False.
Okay. Multiple choice. The transgender community represents 0.3, 1.3, or 3% of the general population.
0.3.
Multiple choice. Which word is transphobic? She-male, new man, or transsexual?
She-male.
Right. Multiple choice. The New Testament the New Treatment Model.
You know, spell it too? Yeah.
The New Treatment Model used with transgender clients suggested by WPATH is called Informed Consent, Medical Model, or Advocacy Model.
Informed consent.
Right. Multiple choice. What's the term to describe someone who is not gender variant? Typical, cisgender, or real?
Cisgender.
Right. True or false? Gender dysphoria usually develops before the age of 7.
True. True.
Okay. Seems like you either knew a lot or you learned a lot. If we have another hour sometime, we can cover further dimensions of trans, like cognitive issues, assessment, treatment plans coming out. Or not coming out. We have no questions.
Oh, wait, you know, we only need this though.
I got you. Yeah, all right, we all
You have to drive?
Oh, yeah, I have.
No, it's from there to here.
So, go ahead.
I will ask the question, it's a great question. What's the direction we're moving in? So there's clothes and toys that previously were labeled girls or boys, and now we're seeing that maybe there are pink and blue clothes or toys, but we're also seeing a move towards just gender-free toys.
Target.
Or gender-free clothes. So we have unisex clothes. So it's just more of that, we are seeing that, we're seeing it in the bathrooms as well, where instead of just ladies and gentlemen, there's bathrooms that have triangles that are saying, you know, it's just a bathroom, like an individual bathroom for everyone to use, or even the whole 10 bathrooms and stalls, the whole 10 bathrooms is just open for everybody. So they are coming up with new signs and posting them on boards, they have them in the conferences. Yeah, and I don't think that that's necessarily what transgender people want. They just want to be included and have a place to go to the bathroom where they don't have to be afraid that they're going to beat up if somebody reaches them.
Yeah.
What possible changes in California law that you said might be happening in 2016 is the law, like bathroom use laws are going to change at school?
Well, the law that just passed was for minors, where they could choose their facility that they want to use. So I don't think it's going to affect minors.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for spending your time.